This is Nick Redding, and you're listening to PreserveCast, a podcast with a worldwide listenership that explores the broad world of preservation from every angle, from drones to mudlarking and everything in between. Now, let's get preserving. On this week's PreserveCast, we're talking with Jim Heid, author of Building Small, a toolkit for real estate entrepreneurs, civic leaders, and great communities. We'll be looking at how building small is a tool for developers to integrate socially responsible, economically resilient, and authentic placemaking, and how this style of development and thinking can be used to accelerate historic rehabs. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast, and today we're very excited to be talking with Jim Heid, who, in addition to being an infill developer and working on sustainable development, also is the author of Building Small, a toolkit for real estate entrepreneurs, civic leaders, and great communities, many of which fall in the category of people who listen to PreserveCast and of great interest to the work that's being done to many of our listeners and the work that they're doing all across the country. So excited to talk with Jim and kind of get to know him a little bit first. So where'd you grow up and what led you to this kind of work at the intersection of real estate and architecture and development? What was your spark moment and your first job in the field?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Northeast, and actually Pittsburgh is where I was born. And as I was thinking about this, I remember, the first 10 years of my life, my mom would always drive. We lived in a little steel town outside of Pittsburgh, but the big thing was always to go into town for Christmas. And I always loved driving by the old buildings, even though they were very disheveled. There was just all these cool industrial buildings and old buildings. And then we moved to Albany, and I found the same thing. A lot of these really cool old mills and downtown brownstones in Albany that were, again, had lost interest and been disinvested, but there was something in them that always spoke to me. And went to school, stumbled into landscape architecture, worked for came back east, went to school actually in Idaho, and then came back east and worked for a couple of years in New England as a landscape architect, doing a lot of urban design work. Got to understand that. But I think the big, I guess the turning point for me was about 15 years into my career, felt that most of this stuff I was designing never got built. And it was kind of like, what is it I don't understand about my clients or what they're facing or whatever else? So I went back and did master's in real estate development. And I often tell students, for me, that was like learning a foreign language. In design school, there's all this kind of jargon and subjective stuff that you learn. And suddenly there was this whole world that opened up about how people make decisions based on finance, internal rates of return, and raising capital. And so it was a real game changer for me and allowed me to kind of take my passion around older buildings and stuff, and then actually start to execute projects and do things the way that I thought they should be done, and also learn why some of the things that we all would like to see happen are either so hard to do or just not feasible.
So I think when a lot of people hear the word developer, they think a lot of different things. But I think
generally not good.
Yeah, generally not good. But even when they think of a preservation developer, they think sort of like what you described, like, okay, we're going to redo an entire mill complex or a giant old building or things like that. And you've been able to kind of focus in on a different type of scale of project oftentimes, which is, this more, which we're going to talk about with your book, but this idea of like small scale infill and the fabric of that. How, for people listening, I mean, maybe first, why did you kind of do that instead of the more traditional, I'm going to go in and do the old factory project? So let's start there. Why? And then maybe we'll talk about the challenges associated with that.
Yeah. So the path to small, I mean, it's a little bit ironic because, as I said, trained as a landscape architect, did the thing, then came back and did a lot of consulting, often sitting between the developer and the design team, kind of translating back and forth. But most of the work I was doing at that time was really big stuff. I mean, 10,000 acres in the Nevada desert, working over in Abu Dhabi. And so in a lot of ways, I should be talking about big. But what I found was it was kind of after we would do our daily work sessions or whatever else, or these big projects, I would always find myself gravitating towards these kind of what I call the nooks and crannies of places. It's the little back alleys, the cool little adaptive reuse that became the gas station that became a beer garden or, food hall or whatever else. And I just really got fascinated with how much you can do with very little space, very little building, very small parcel. And more importantly, the people who were driving these conversations and doing these projects. So, it became the basis of the book because I wanted to tell that story. The stuff that I saw was so important to the fabric of communities. But then I wanted to understand, okay, is this just kind of cool, or does this stuff really matter, and does it make a difference? And we can talk about it later, but it makes a big difference, and I think it's really important. And yet was not getting much attention from, in a lot of ways, civic leaders, because they all wanted the home run. They wanted the big, 2-block project to come in and fix everything, as opposed to curating a bunch of little projects.
And the challenge associated with it, it seems more challenging just because you don't have the margins aren't quite as big when you're dealing with a really small little building. Is it as challenging as it sounds? And is it, or are there ways of making it work?
There's challenges and there's incredible joy and opportunities that come out of it. And is, one of the things that I talk about a lot in the book was drawn from this thing that I do called the Small Scale Developer Forum, which is a twice-a-year gathering of people in this space. And we go to a different city and we see projects and we hear from developers and we hear from policymakers. And it was really their stories and the things that I've seen that kind of drove me to write the book as a way to tell that story. But the common thread in all of that is, yes, it is hard. Pound for pound, ounce of blood for ounce of blood, it's more work than big because you just have less outcome to amortize, whether it's the intellectual cost, emotional cost, financial cost over. But it also, what we see, the people that are involved in this, is a much more, I would say, tactile approach to building and impacting your community, because you really get to, you get to touch every piece of it. And so these projects are highly curated, have a unique story to tell. They're constantly evolving. They have a lot of personality. And I use the word soul a lot because I think they are the things that define and help keep a community's soul and character. So there's an enormous amount of gratification, and that's why I do it. But the capital is hard. The approvals are hard. The construction is hard. I mean, it's all hard. And again, you're dealing with 10,000 square feet instead of 100,000 or a million square feet, which at some point it's that's just a matter of scale. It's more efficient when you get to the bigger size.
Yeah, it seems like it's always the same amount of work. At Preservation Maryland, which powers PreserveCast, we just wrapped up a sub 1,000 square foot log cabin, and I swear it's as much work as a 1,000,000 square foot property. There's just a lot less money to be made.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk about the book. So you've got a new book, Building Small, a Toolkit for Real Estate Entrepreneurs, Civic Leaders, and Great Communities. Why the book? We're going to talk about the next forum for small scale developers. So people listening who are interested in this or perhaps do some small scale development might participate in that. But where did the kind of the concept come from? And maybe we can define sort of what you mean by building small and what the toolkit is.
Yeah, so the short backstory, as I mentioned, is I do these forums, and the forums really grew out of, I've been very involved for years with the Urban Land Institute. It's an organization that I have a great respect for and a lot of appreciation, but was watching as a lot of its content got more and more focused on big projects and big capital, and so started the forum with the organization support to try and reach a different audience, which I thought were people who might be coming into development or wanting to work within their communities. And very quickly found this, we've had about 400 people now participate in these forums, people who, they don't want to build big, they want to build small. And so again, it was their stories, it was the impact, it was the challenges, it was the benefits that as we would go to these different places, they were just so moving. and also so frustrating. It was like, somebody's got to tell this story. So the book grew out of that. And at the same time, I was starting my own projects. And so one of the things that I often say is if I had finished the book on time, it would have been a very different book, because the 2 extra years that I took to write it, I was doing my own projects, and I learned kind of the personal challenges, let alone some of the technical challenges of building small that really go into it. So the book is really meant, it's for two audiences. It's for the entrepreneur that wants to do this as their life's work or get started in it. But it's also for civic leaders and even citizens that say, this is what we want in our community. We want stuff that's smaller. We want more fine grain. We want more, adaptive reuse of existing buildings. As a way to communicate to them how most of the rules and regs and approvals processes work against what they're saying they want. And if they truly want this, there are things that the average citizen and the civic leaders need to do to make this, as we talked about earlier, easier rather than harder than big, so that more people are able to step in and make it happen.
Sort of reminds me of the difference between large scale ag, growing wheat on 1,000-acre field versus doing row crops, and growing carrots. And it's funny because we need carrots just as much, if not more, than we need wheat. But nobody wants to incentivize the carrot grower. And that's a very hard thing to do, just like small scale ag. So what are if you don't mind, and people can pick up the book, we'll put a link in the show notes, not only to Jim's website, but to the book itself. But, what do you see as the biggest barriers? You've worked across the country, you've worked with developers from across the country. Is there a common theme? If you're revitalization king for a day, you're going to change 3 things. What are those 3 things that are like, these are barriers that communities can change that make it really work?
Yeah, it's absolutely. And we've done the forums in urban centers. We've done them in emerging urban areas. We've done them in suburban corridors. We've done them in rural communities. And interestingly, the 2 barriers are the same no matter where you go. And it starts with capital and it ends with regulations. So the capital side is challenging because, like we talked about, the level of effort, it's a lot easier to make one $100 million loan than it is 100 $1 million loans. So the need to find an alternative way to capitalize small is really critical. I think crowdfunding is an interesting opportunity that is just starting, kind of a nascent, but we need to figure out a way to get Main Street. That's all the people that say that's what they want in their community. We need to give them a pathway to support that so that it's easier. Because as a small developer, we probably spend 50% of our time trying to raise money. And that doesn't leave a lot of time to do the projects that we're really passionate and kind of where our talents are. Then the regulatory side is there's multifacets to it. But first of all, the regulations are set up to create certainty, prescribe outcomes, because everybody's afraid of what could possibly happen, as opposed to, hey, let's experiment. Let's see what could happen. So you prescribe things to a way that you're constantly trying to innovate against old ideas. Some of the simple things are like parking. A lot of places where they're successful, they're just getting rid of parking requirements because you've got a small parcel. You want to fill it up with use. You don't want to dedicate half of it to parking. Land use, allowing more mixed use and allowing form-based buildings as opposed to prescribing the use, which drives the form. Describe the form that you want, build to the street, address the street properly. Approval process. First of all, getting the fees. So a lot of communities now are on a cost recovery system where the process of approvals has to pay for the department. So they would much rather spend their time on big projects because they pay more fees and they require, therefore, less work per dollar of fee collected versus small projects, and then throw in their adaptive reuse and historic preservation projects. They're a lot more work because you've got to figure out ways to get around codes that don't comply with the building you're trying to preserve. So figuring out a fee structure that really relates to small. And then one of the really interesting things that we saw, Phoenix, Arizona, which you would not think is a leader in adaptive reuse, but they have actually written some codes and have created 2 things. They've created grant programs for smaller buildings to adaptively reuse, that they actually provide some money for that. But more importantly, they've created this thing called the Office of Customer Advocacy, where if I'm a small developer, I show up at that desk and they assign one person to me to help me navigate the entire labyrinth of all the approvals that I need to go through and become my advocate and my champion. So I'm not, this individual with a 10,000 square foot, strip center that I'm trying to convert into something really meaningful and valuable for the neighborhood, and having to run to 15 departments. They're helping me figure that out. They're helping navigate and clear the decks. And that kind of ombudsman approach, I think, is really, really important for the small developer, because you don't have the time to you don't have the time or the money to hire attorneys, to hire engineers. You're doing it all yourself, and you need a clearer path to get there quicker.
I think those are excellent takeaways. Perhaps there's some policymakers listening. I know that there often are, who can pick those up and run with them. Let's take a break here, come back, talk about maybe some success. What are sort of common themes for success in this field, and then talk about the next forum for small scale developers and what you're working on now. And we'll do that right here on PreserveCast. Historic preservation can't happen without skilled tradespeople to perform the work, and there's a critical need right now for those tradespeople. The Campaign for Historic Trades, powered by Preservation Maryland, is working to meet that need by strengthening apprenticeship opportunities within historic trades. In partnership with the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Training Center and Conservation Legacy, the campaign is currently recruiting for NPS Traditional Trades Apprenticeship Program, or TTAP. TTAP's an intensive 20-week apprenticeship that provides young adults the chance to learn historic trade skills while working on America's most iconic historic sites. Multiple positions are open for the 2022 season at national parks across the country. Visit historictrades.org for more information on TTAP and how to apply today. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast today. We're excited to be joined by Jim Heid, author of Building Small, a toolkit for real estate entrepreneurs, civic leaders, and great communities. We've been talking all about what got him into this line of work, how you do small development, and what the book identified and his work has identified as the real barriers to this and what could be done to fix some of that. I'm curious, is there something that when it comes to, say, a preservation group or an individual is thinking about tackling a project or promoting a project or advocating for something, when you look at small scale development, are there certain things that pop out at you about a project where you're like, that one's going to succeed and this one isn't? Are there markers that you can look for, or is it really kind of all over the place?
That's a great question. And I don't know if there's back up a second and talk about what defines small, because I think that's really important. And we've gone into it in more detail in the book, but instead of writing a singular definition, provided what we call the 10 hallmarks of small. But the first thing is to say that it's not a quantitative, it's not about square feet, it's not about dollars. It's really about the attitude of the developer. And the shorthand that I use is somebody who is committed to building community instead of commodity. So they really see real estate development as the vehicle by which they increase the vitality and the connectedness of people in the community. So it's not about, I'm going to build this and I'm going to get X return. It's, I really want to figure out a way to catalyze reinvestment in this neighborhood, or I really see this important opportunity that's not being utilized, and I want to bring that to life. And you do that through real estate development, and then it has all these spin-off effects. So the markers might be, the common threads are you have people who are heavily emotionally, intellectually, and financially invested in the project. And it's why small is important to local economies, because it's not an out-of-town developer that, hey, the market turned on me, I'm just going to fire sale this property and leave. It's like, no, I've got my entire balance sheet tied up in that property that I bought, and I've got to make sure this succeeds. So, we see that kind of commitment that weathers the storm as being really important. I think projects that we often talk about small is not build to suit. It's not like, I've got to use it, I'm going to build this purpose-built building. It's we were just down in San Antonio, and Bill Schoen, who was the visionary and developer of the Pearl District, but he talked about loose fit, long life. and this idea that, these buildings are vessels for a lot of things to occur over time. And so a lot of adaptability, a lot of evolutionary attitudes. So not getting too tied down with a specific program, but creating, a highly flexible format that you can evolve as you figure out what's really working for the community and or as markets change.
And it's funny you say that, because, that sort of triggers in the mind. We can all think of examples probably in our communities where, because the use was too prescribed, there's no real way to reuse the structure, or it just is, it's designed to fall apart and then in 30 years be torn down. And that kind of stuff is actually what seems to kill communities, is too prescribed in what it's supposed to be. These older buildings are so adaptable, but then there's certain types of more modern structures where it's just, how else do you reuse the Sheetz gas station or something like that?
Right. No, it's a really good point. It goes back to your question earlier about, what are some of the things it can do? And it's one of my big concerns, the highly prescriptive nature of so many approvals, because people are so afraid of experimentation and evolution that by the time you finally run the gauntlet of approvals, you're stuck with something that no longer meets what the market, is looking for. And so the ability to create adaptability and flexibility around the principles of good design. Just street level transparency, interest, variety, good scale, good materiality, all of those things seems to get lost in the discussion of trying to prescribe the outcome. So,
and sometimes that's not even a part of the conversation. I live in a community where it's hey, if it's in the zoning, you build it. And there's really no conversation about design at all.
Yeah, because I think, unfortunately, I think we don't have a lot of people who are trained in urban design. They're trained in how to administer policies and programs and prescriptive codes. And therefore, we're not, like you said, we're not focusing on the right part of the conversation. So
interesting. So you've got the book, you've got this forum. So let's talk a little bit about the forum, and then maybe talk about how historic property developers can get engaged in that too. But when is the next forum? How do people get engaged? Is there a way to stay engaged outside of the in-person get-togethers? And you said it grew out of ULI, but where is it and where are you meeting next?
Yeah. So we just finished our 17th one. We typically do one in the spring and one in the fall. We try to do East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, or Heartland. And so this next one will be November 6th through 8th in Nashville, Tennessee. So we're really excited about going there. We said our last one was in San Antonio. It's typically about a 3-day program. Group attendance is very intimate. It's about 80 people. And so you really build a strong connection to people in the room and people like yourselves. And I think it's one of the things that I hear most from people that have come is like, I feel like I finally found my tribe after going to all of these different conferences where they're talking about stuff that's sort of relevant. This is like super relevant. And the programming is a lot of tours and case studies, as well as panel discussions about development specific to this kind of small genre. So for people that are interested in this space, they always walk away with both a lot of tools and specific skills, but also I think just a network of other people like themselves, kind of working as entrepreneurs, maybe working by themselves, that they can pick up the phone and call. So I have a long list of people now when I'm doing a deal. It's like sending the pro forma, hey, take a look at this. What did I miss? So it really creates this organic support system that I think is really important.
And how do people get engaged if they want to, come in November or they want to learn more about it?
Yeah. So the easiest thing, is my website, jheid.com. There is a page on there called, this is under the banner of the initiative to make small big. And there's a whole page there where you can find the book, you can sign up for the forums, advance notice of the forums. And then I'm going to be launching later this year a new program called Small Coach, which is based on an entrepreneurial coaching program that I've been a part of as a coachee, not as the coach, and trying to intersect what it is to be an entrepreneur with this idea of small development. So part practical skills and part life skills of how do you navigate the world of development.
And so I feel like people listening are probably interested. What are you working on now? You wrote a book, you host conferences, you do all this kind of stuff. Do you have a small deal happening as we speak?
Yeah, I just finished an adaptive reuse of an old bank into a co-working space. So I actually started the operating company and run the operating company and then lease it from the space that I built out. And it's we opened 60 days before COVID. So it's been a very interesting ride to see how that's worked out. But a great testament to this idea of loose fit, long life, because a lot of things I couldn't afford to build out that I had in the plans. And I'm so glad I didn't, because when COVID hit, I was able to adapt and pivot and move stuff around, and it really worked super well. And then I just finished an 8-unit cottage court that pleased to say we just won a bunch of national awards for a couple of weeks ago. But really interesting little infill project, all detached homes, 10 units per acre on a little 1.2 acre site with accessory dwelling units and everything else. Pretty cool design. And then right now I'm kind of embarking on raising capital for a mixed use project in my town here. It's an old half-acre gas station. It's one of the classic small development projects. Yeah, 100% corner with a 1960s gas station on it that's been sitting vacant for a long time. So, pretty anxious to get that one under contract and going. Complete with the underground storage tanks. It's gone, actually. All of that is gone. So yeah. So
very, very lucky. So before we go, we always ask everybody if they have a favorite historic place or site.
Yeah, well, you sent me that last night. And I was thinking about it. I mean, I have a lot of them. So my daughter just graduated from College of Charleston. So as a place, city of Charleston, and not only because of its historic nature and its long, successful history with preservation, but I think how well they have integrated new contemporary designs into the fabric. So the fabric is super strong. It reeks of history and extraordinarily architecture, but then they've also been very good about figuring out ways to, not just stop in time, but actually evolve. And I think the place that's right behind that then is Savannah. I was there at the same time we were in Charleston, and I was amazed after going there for years. I feel like Savannah's at the tipping point where all of its preservation has been great, but they're finally breathing new life into some of the infill. And there's some very cool, interesting projects going on that are really starting to round out the historic fabric in a really meaningful way. So.
Cool. Well, 2 great places with some good infill stories. It's been fun having you on. Looking forward to hearing more from you. And maybe we can highlight the work that happens at the convening at some point in the future as well. And again, in the show notes will be a link to Jim's website as well as the book, so you can pick it up and learn a little something along the way. And get involved in small-scale development in a big way. So thanks so much for joining us today, Jim.
Thank you, Nick. Real pleasure. Really fun to do this. Look forward to what people have to say after it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to PreserveCast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.